Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Mazzarese with AST Environmental. I'll be the MC and the moderator for today's webinar. This is a webinar that Dr. Ed Winter gave at the recent National Underground Storage Tanks Conference, which is in Spokane, Washington. You can see there on the title slide. This is set for about 30 minutes, so it gives us about 15 minutes for Q&A. So you can go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A or in the questions. We'll go ahead and address those at the end. If you do have any questions while Ed's presenting, I'll also be monitoring the chat. And this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to jump off early, please let me know, or if you'd like to share this with a colleague, we can go ahead and send you the link once it's loaded up into YouTube. Ed, I will go ahead and hand it off to you.
Hey, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. So I spent a few years as a branch manager of underground storage tanks in Kentucky, and it's always kind of stayed close to me. And I've thought quite a bit about, how do you handle a large portfolio like so many states do? And these are some of the conclusions I've come to, or things that I hope will be helpful to you. Now, when you think of the large portfolio, and you're handling it day to day, I kind of think of the car salesman analogy. So when you go to buy a car, what's the game? Well, first of all, they want you to imagine yourself in that car. Well, that's real easy. You're already there on the parking lot. You're probably doing that. The next thing they want you to do is focus on monthly payments. Because for most people, they think, well, if I can afford the monthly payment, it's okay. And they want you to overlook the total amount. UST funds are similar, right? You might have an annual budget of 10, 20, 30 million dollars. But people oftentimes don't think, well, what does that add up to over 30 years? So you think, well, if my annual budget is fine, then I'm great. But the actuarial reality is similar to that of buying a car, that low monthly payments add up to massive cost over time. So if you want to save money, what you have to do is cut off those payments. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, I have what's called a loss development triangle. So most of your programs somewhere has an actuarial. And the point of that actuarial is to project what you're going to have to pay into the future. So if you look at, in this particular one, accident year, or in this case, a release year you could think of 2019, then you see dollars paid for the first 12 months, for the next 24 months, 36 months, etc. But all of those dollars paid are dollars paid for a release that occurred in 2019, such that when you look at it 72 months, you're still paying. Now, and this is just a illustration. In this case, this is not from an actual tanks fund because it would be too long and too big to put on the slide. The next cohort is 2020, and you see the cost build up over the months, such that you see your ultimate lower down on this. The ultimate projected losses are much higher than you might anticipate just looking at the monthly losses. This is greatly exaggerated in a UST fund. So the problem, modeling data from multiple Midwestern sites, I use Midwestern sites to avoid the extremes of the coast, suggests that it would take 100 people working full time for 33.3 years to complete a 500 site portfolio. This is assuming that the current practices that I see reflected in the actuarials remain unchanged. The estimated cost for that work, excluding inflation, is going to be a little over $600 million. If we try to work in inflation, it might be $900 million, close to $1 billion over that time. I pick a 500 site portfolio because that's kind of typical for a middle Midwestern site, Midwestern state. So obviously this is not really sustainable. It may look sustainable year to year, but over time, if it really does approach $1 billion, that's a lot of money. So let's think about the generic per day cost for an open site. And so you look on the left-hand side here, and I have a distribution. And this distribution is made up from a few Midwestern sites. I could have put more in, but this is consistent with what I've seen in the past. This is for 2024 data, so it's recent data as opposed to older data. And what we want to see is, well, what do the averages look like? What are we looking at? And what we see, should be some arrows here. Let me put some arrows. Aha, there's an arrow. So the triangle represents my estimated value of what it costs to keep a site open. And the way I did that was say, well, let's say they're going to do quarterly monitoring and they're going to put in a few random wells a year. And what I found is that really equals up to about $145.75 a day. So then I decided, okay, well, let's look at these 5 states that I have. And what we see is that the mean is about $139.67 a day. And you'll notice the standard deviation on that's about $20. So, it could be, call it 40, 50, 60, or it could be 110. The statistical precision. Now, one of the ways you do this is just by pulling out your high and low data. And that's what I did. And we do end up still at about $145 a day with a smaller standard deviation, which is kind of what you would expect. Now, I'm not telling you that these numbers are absolutely right, but they're probably pretty close. If we were to look at them on the coast, for those of you who are in California and New York, you'll see you expect your expenses to be higher. California to be about $200 a day, New York to be about $173 a day. So it's good to keep in mind, what is it costing you, in a sense, to just dog paddle a site into the future? About $145 a day. So time is not on your side. A 1-day increase in project duration could be about $145. That's one way to look at it. Using the annual average inflation rate over the past 15 years, in 10 years, it'll cost you about $187 a day. Presently, against the background of what is done, a single month's delay on a project could cost you $4,350. That's assuming the PMs continue, your project managers continue to average in that interim period. So time to final closure. Now you'll actually find this graph to be probably far more generous. And the reason being is that we're looking at 2024 data and we've cut out a lot of the pre-1989 data. So you might recall that the 1989 closures took out a lot of steel tanks, steel lines, things like that, and we started requiring double wall tanks, double wall lines. So the releases since that time have not been as bad. You should also keep in mind that the older systems pre-89 also had higher benzene levels, which is your typical risk driver. Benzene levels in gasoline now are much lower than they once were. So in this model, using the newer data, it takes about 5.8 years or 6 years to close a site. Standard deviation on that is 3.5 years as a round figure. So the mean and the median is 5.35 years. So it's pretty close. They're pretty close to each other. That's good. Shows you there's less dispersion in the data. And the mode, the number that occurs most often is 4 years. To give you a sense of where this is going, the 98th percentile is 9.2 years, all on our newer data. The median cost, if these numbers are true, if I took 5.35 years and 365 days a year at $145 a day. That gives you a median cost for a site of $280,000. I think most of you who work in this area would go, yep, that's about what it is, about 300, good number. Now, what I've done in this graph to make it simple to understand is I decided I'm going to have a mixed portfolio of 500 sites in various phases of cleanup. So this would be like someone walked into your office and said, here's your portfolio of sites, and they just dropped them on your table. People may have been working on them in the past, or they may have just come into you that very day. And what we're trying to do is project where these 500 sites are going and what it's going to cost. So we're going to look at it over 15 years. That doesn't mean that some sites wouldn't last longer. You know, a lot of the pre-89 sites are still open today, 35 years later or more. But that's not where most of your sites are going now, the newer sites in your portfolio. So the green line at $35 million shows you the number of open sites. And you'll see that it decreases with time, as you would expect. The red line is that 2024 cohort and what it's going to cost you at roughly 2024 prices, where the orange line is 2029 prices. And you can imagine with your eye that the red line bleeds into the orange line at approximately year 5 or 6. You'll see in the first 2 years, right here, that the overall inflation cost of the portfolio as a whole bumps your cost up, even as you are closing some of those easy sites in the first 2 years. So the first 2 years, as you start dealing with this portfolio, you're just beat by inflation. The bulk of your sites should be closing somewhere past year 2, between year 2 and 3 to year 7. And this is also where you transition from the red line to the yellow line because inflation has driven you up to that. And then finally, you have what we call complex sites. These are sites that are similar to those pre-89 sites. They have some sort of geological complexity, some sort of massive release, some mistakes in management or whatever, such that they take longer than 10 years to close. And this is what that portfolio would look like. And you would need to project forward in how you are going to handle this portfolio. So what do these models illustrate for us? There's a key early lesson. In the beginning years 0 to 2, inflation outpaced your savings. The critical performance period where you close most of your sites is year 3 to 7. Later actions towards that year 5 to 6 start costing you 22 to 33% higher in cost. So obviously, if you want to save money, you want to close those sites early. Your final 59 sites in this model from year 2024 will, at year 10, will still cost you between $4.6 and $5.6 million in annual cost. So that could be, depending on your particular state and your particular fund, that could be anywhere from 1/6 to 1/4 of the total dollars that are brought in annually. Your success matrix, evolution of those are based on focusing on that 3 to 7 year period. In that period, you want to get speed of closure because you're racing against inflation. Speed of closure is exceedingly important. In the later years, when you hit those ones that have drug out, you really need to think about, well, flexibility. Like, can I leave a little NAPL in place? Can I exceed cleanup criteria in some wells but not others? Can I model the risk in such a way as that I'm confident that no one's going to be harmed, and yet there's still contamination in place. You need to be imaginative, because those sites have already demonstrated that they've stumped you. And basically they can become, it's unprofessional to say this, but they can become money pits. So structure early discernment into your program. For most UST programs, you'll find that your most competent, experienced staff want to work on those complex sites, which are your money holes. However, you really need the competent staff seeing the sites early to ensure that you close most of them in that early 3 to 7 year period. So an effective potential suggestion is this. I've marked this as high resolution site characterization, and I'm using EPA's 2023 study on high resolution site characterization at petroleum underground storage tank sites. In their study, and it was largely based on expert opinion, keep that in mind, HRSC, and I'm using this as a stand-in for early actions, right? Because you might use UST, you might use multi-incremental sampling, you might use MIP, you might use electrical resistivity. It's really going to depend on the site, but focusing early in on these characterization tools other than monitoring wells can save you 9 to 19% in project cost, according to their expert survey. Sometimes it could add 20% to your cost. It could also save you 40% on some projects. Your time savings is 3.3 years versus 10 years historically, and 3.7 years on a catastrophic release. So I'm going to use EPA's parameters out of this document in a chi-square model with newer data. So let's look at what we see. And in this case, again, similar to setting a 500 site portfolio, I set the cost of the spend at 60K. Obviously, if you set it at higher or lower numbers, you get slightly different answers. But I will say, if I put this at 75K versus 60K, the graph looks virtually identical. So what do you see? You see roughly in those first 3 years that your baseline costs are probably cheaper without using HSRC. And what's the thinking here? Or why would you think that's so? I guess is the way I should word that. That would probably be so because most of these sites are going to be your easy sites that would close anyway. By year 3, you're down to 350 sites. But at this point, you see that spending $60,000 on HSRC is going to save you money. Notice the green line with HSRC is below the red line. So you've got those annual cost savings. Your optimal strategy is essentially that 70% of your sites get aggressive early characterization, which I'm calling HSRC. Again, there's a number of approaches to what that might actually mean, but focusing in on the tools that would tell you where the contamination is, as opposed to a lot of monitoring wells and quarterly sampling. Your savings between $8 and $15 million over 15 years for the 500 site portfolio. The time saving, now notice the time saving is a little different here because the model is a little different and the data is a little different, but your time saving is 2.5 years as a median. Your return on investment is 200 to 400% return. So this is not the same as the EPA's analysis. This is using those parameters from the EPA's analysis as to savings, but it's a different data set. So what about the time savings? The mean is 2.7 years. The median is 2.5 years. That's pretty close. That's good. Standard deviation is about 1.6 years. The one way you can look at standard deviation is 3 standard deviations is like 97.5 percentile. If you wanted to range out on that. The range is 4.8 months to 5.5 years. So cost and returns for your 500 site portfolio, the total expenditure would be 16 million for HSRC. Your total savings on that same portfolio would be 139 million for a net savings of 123 million. And that's really how I would want you to look at it. How can I get a return on investment? By focusing early on truly understanding where the contaminant mass is and focusing on that, as opposed to, in a sense, the random hunt and peck monitoring well style. Now, which tools you would actually use would be site specific. So looking at that data, what does the summary of these graphs mean to this point? Well, if you look at your investment, your high confidence is going to be sites that are older than 2 years, because sites less than 2 years will probably close on their own. Or sites that are stalled in remediation, or sites that you know from the very beginning had catastrophic releases. Sometimes your project managers will look at it and say, man, this is going to be an expensive one. You already know, because you know the history, you know the background of that site. If you're looking and you're saying, I know this is going to cost $400,000, then you don't have to wait for 2 years. You'll bring out this extensive characterization very early on. Sometimes you know that you have other indicators of complexity, like they've had multiple tanks there. It's a very old site. It's in unique geology. In any of these cases, you ought to move towards early characterization using multiple tools. Moderate risk, where you're getting a 20 to 75% return on investment. The sites are 1 to 2 years old. The projected cost is less than the 400,000, say 150 to 400,000. This is closer to your near break-even threshold, but that's okay. It shows some early signs of complexity, and your HSRC or your early heavy characterization doesn't really extend beyond 10 to 15% of the total projected cost. Your high risk for early and heavy characterization are sites that are under a year old. You don't even really understand anything about them yet. Everyone's looking at it. They don't expect at that point in time to be a very expensive one. They'd expect it easily under 200,000. Or someone wants to do HRSC, which is greater than 20% of the total cost that you're projecting. That would be the 200,000. Simple sites, you got to worry if 70% of the money is already spent for that site, right? And I have some other rules over there on the far right-hand side of the page that are very similar to these. They're just slightly different. You can look at those at some other time. So implementation. Structure early discernment into your program. You should have, and I've said it, but I'm going to repeat it. You should have your most experienced and skilled personnel looking at closures and initiating site characterization. These very same people, most of the time, will not want to do this work. They'll want to be on the complex side. They'll want to be on the sites with the unique and interesting geology, they think, or the long history, or the ones that are essentially the ghost stories of your underground storage tank branch. But those are not the sites that are going to save you the money. It's the early discernment that'll save you money. So one way to do this, and I'm just making this up, you have to figure out how you work with your own group, but set up the evaluations as special group projects where you can have, the younger people who are learning, who are coming up, train with the people who have experience, because skill is needed early. That's where your dollars are spent. That's where they're also lost or saved. Now, I'm almost taking a rabbit trail here to the side, but it's not. You'll see how important this is. And I want you to think of the analogy of a water tower. You can see a water tower and you can turn your tap on and water will come out of it. But you cannot determine the amount of water by examining flow at the tap. Monitoring wells are very similar. You can sample a well many, many times, but the concentration of benzene in the water does not tell you the mass. What I have here is written in the ground, but the ultimate mass attached to the media, which would be both the soil and aquifer materials, as well as the bulk of the water. And yet that is what you have to address. That is the most important thing to address. So you need to find the mass of contamination and keep in mind that most of it is going to be attached to soil and aquifer materials. It is that mass which you have to address to prevent sustained exposure. So in your program, what is the goal? The goal is that no one be exposed. So you don't want a completed exposure pathway. You certainly don't want a sustained exposure at sufficient concentrations to actually cause a risk. Now, oftentimes, you'll see people chasing plumes trying to figure out whether it's getting near anyone. I can't tell you not to do that, but I can say that the sooner you act on the core mass that feeds any kind of plume, the more confident you can be that people won't be able to sustain an exposure. And it's the sustaining of an exposure that actually causes the harm. Okay, so I've got a little graph here on my left, and the green represents a safe exposure, concentrations below a level that could cause harm. Yellow represents, well, kind of getting dangerous, and red represents dangerous. And what can you see? You can see at very low concentrations, you're probably safe at any time for any period of time. But as the concentration goes up, if you allow enough time, you'll go right from the green into the yellow, the doubtful, right into the red. This is something you need to focus on. How do you protect people? You don't just protect them from the concentration that you might have pulled from a monitoring well, but you protect them by ensuring that they can't be exposed over a long period of time. You do that by taking care of the mass as early as possible in your effort. So this is what I'm choosing to call risk-informed remediation. So it extends risk-based decisions. Risk-based decisions for many, many programs are set out as having different kinds of sites, and those sites that have certain characteristics have certain cleanup goals. But real risk assessment is based on individual risk assessments on each site, meaning each site gets its own number. But that's not really what I'm talking about at the moment. I'm talking a little different, that risk informed recognizes the characteristics of risk, but focuses on the contaminant mass and the stratigraphy that retains that mass. It wants to avoid chasing dissolved phase plumes in favor of early action at the source. Doesn't mean you can't do both, but I have oftentimes seen that a lot of early effort goes into figuring out where the end of the plume is without figuring out where the source of the plume really is located. The objective is to reduce the possibility of sustaining an exposure. If you can't sustain an exposure, then you probably are not harmed. The better characterization one has, the more you move away from these baseline risk assumptions, and are actually looking at site-specific risk assessment. Risk-informed prioritizes expenditures that prevent the sustained exposure. I've repeated that twice, but it's very important. And risk-informed considers something that most programs hate to consider, that at any day the legislature could decide to end the bleeding. I mean, after all, you might spend $1 billion on a portfolio in time, and they might sunset your program. So you always have to consider as you work day to day, what condition do you want these sites to be in if you or your program is forced to walk away from those sites? And I would contend that the best position for you to be in is that you have addressed the core mass. And risk informed also considers opportunity cost across the portfolio. So you're looking at the portfolio as a whole, as opposed to site by site, looking at your expenditures as a whole. Lessons and approaches. Spend money early on aggressive characterization. This is the basic lesson. Have your most competent people direct that. Even at the risk of spending more on a site than the data ultimately supports, because you can't see the exact future for an individual site, but you can see the future of your entire portfolio if you don't change the direction in which you're headed. And I'm assuming, of course, as you're listening to me, you're acting like these middle Midwestern states, which are part of my model. Now, you may be personally acting quite differently, but nevertheless, focus on the mass of contamination, not the extent of the plume. Use HRSC-like tools to find the mass in three-dimensional space. When you don't know what to do, don't direct another round of sampling or install more monitoring wells based on intuition. Why? Monitoring wells are terribly expensive, and I could make a whole study out of that. But think about it. You have to install them. You have to sample them. You have to send the samples to the lab, and then you have to take the wells back out. Build into your organization, this is the final point, exceedingly important also, acceptable space for failure. Because no one can see inside the earth. You can't learn without experience. And innovation within your program is not risk-free. But if you want the future to look different than the past, then you have to do something different. Okay, I appreciate it, everybody. If there's any questions, we'll see if I can deal with them or not. Mike, back to you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, we please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A chat here, and we'll go ahead and start addressing those. Well, I guess, Ed, I'll kind of kick things off. I mean, you talked about the high-res characterization and using the traditional, I guess, HRSC tools, right? So MIP, UVOS, and all that.
Right.
And one thing that I see often is using that information, giving that information to vendors to be able to develop a design. And as we all know, that data is qualitative. And I guess that's something that, at least on my side, kind of communicating with clients to make sure that if you're out there doing that type of work, which is great, it helps really define the box, but it doesn't help quantify it, right? And that was one of the points of your presentation is being able to quantify, especially source area mass, transitioning that from using that data, right, to be able to do more of an RDC, or remedial design characterization, where you do maybe some high density soil and groundwater sampling. So maybe you could spend a few minutes kind of talking about transitioning, from an HRSC. But I think one thing that's important is, and it ties in with the budget, right, is doing this all in the same mobilization, so you have all that data in one go versus having to do it in, separate mobilizations.
Okay. Yeah, I think you just dealt with it. Nevertheless,
Yeah.
I'll talk some.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just
So when
get
you
your
put the
comments on it.
yeah when you put the model together, I used the data from HRSC that EPA used, but yet what we're really talking about is focusing on aggressive characterization early. And that might be using many of those traditional HSRC tools, I don't know, throw out electrical resistivity, whatever, to make sure you've determined where the mass is. And then what do you do about it? Well, you have to have some sort of measure of that mass. Since most of your contamination is bound to soil and aquifer materials, you'll probably do some multi-incremental type sampling through all of that because you need to be able to calculate mass. You need to have a
Mm,
sense. It's back to that water tower. If you don't know how, you can't tell how much water is in the water tower just by looking at your tap, nor can you tell how much contamination is really in your site by looking at your monitoring wells. You can say, boy, this is a really hot site, but what does that mean?
mhm,
And you need to know what that means. And once you have figured out where the primary mass is located, that's what you're going to attack with the remedy that you think is pertinent, most pertinent to that site. Now, of course, being a vendor of remedies, we want to say that's ours, but I'll leave that up to you. That's not the point of this particular presentation. Point of this
mhm,
particular presentation is to encourage you to see the value of acting early.
mhm,
But you're right. If you don't know, if you haven't done something that's quantitative regarding your mass, you still have only part of the answer at hand.
mhm. Yeah, I guess just to tack onto that a little bit, I would just recommend those that are here, this, remediations in the future, in the near term, you're going out and doing like a high res event, like a MIP event, for example, or UVOST, typically tools that are used on these type of sites. Communicate with, the folks that are going to be doing the remedial design, because what I see often is they're taking the recommendation of the high res vendors and they're trying to, confirm, I saw a high response here on the PID, low response here. And that data is important to be able to do that. However, still that's not usually enough dense of a data set to be able to make informed decisions on technology selection and, or combined remedy. Um, so um, I guess that also goes to, geology as well, right? We learn a lot when we when you use those tools, you get things like the HPT or the electrical conductivity. Um, but also, I think there's a lot of value in taking soil cores, right? Because we've inherited, a lot of us have inherited sites, where you actually haven't seen, we've all seen good boring logs and poor boring logs, and that's coming from an engineer, right? Um, but actually getting your eyes and your hands, being able to see the soil cores, be able to actually, see where those key transitions are in the geology. And, obviously that helps you guide you with conceptual site model development, but also where you're going to collect those actual lab samples, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very difficult to plan what you want to do for a site and how do you get to the end of it if the approach that's being taken is 2 to 4 new monitoring wells a year and 4 quarters of sampling, walking it out uh, after the plume, chasing the plume.
Mhm.
This is oftentimes what is done
Mhm.
until finally you start to run out of money and people get panicky or the site owner gets angry and you know
Mhm.
something like that. And that's really what I'm trying to get people to see, that your monitoring wells are not really helping you get to the end of your problem. Most states require 1 up gradient and 2 down gradient wells with long screens. That's an excellent way to see if you've got a problem. It's a terrible way to resolve a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
it's a very expensive way to try to characterize a problem by walking out and then, at times deciding, well, I'll put a tighter screen here or I'll put a longer screen there, just kind of randomly. So
mhm,
the real goal is to say, okay, I know I have a problem. I've seen my up gradient and down gradient wells. And instead of moving immediately to put in more wells, that's when you should move immediately to find out where is the mass of the contamination
mhm,
located. If your regulations require you to find the end of the plume, that's fine. Reach out as far as you can and kind of meet the spirit of the regulation, but don't do that to the exclusion of finding out actually where your mass is, then moving to determine roughly what the total mass of that is, looking at the stratigraphy and deciding how are you going to address that core mass. The rest of your contamination can ultimately burn itself out if you have taken care of the source. Now,
mhm,
how you would handle that would be state specific and regulation specific. But that's really the goal of what I want people to see in this, that spending money early to actually understand where the mass is so that you can attack the real source of the problem will save you money. It'll save
mhm,
you a lot of money, and it'll help avoid getting to the end of, what is a million, 1.5 million, whatever your state budget is per site. It'll save you from getting right up there near the end of it. And then everybody says, well, what are we going to do? A lot of times at that point, you just don't have the money. The other aspect is this is scary. This is not what most people do. Most people want to just put in wells. It's a very comfortable thing to do. Your contractors know how to do it. The state project managers know a lot about wells. Actually, they've probably seen more wells than anybody, at least from a paperwork point of view. And you almost can't go wrong, except for when you look at it over time, the cost is going wrong.
mhm,
So that's what we're trying to spare you. This is a kind of a broad outline of lessons learned.
mhm. Excellent. Well, thank you, Ed, for the presentation. And as I mentioned early on, this is being recorded, and so please reach out to me. It'll be posted on the AST and RPI websites here in the next week or two, once it gets downloaded and uploaded to YouTube. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. And thank you everyone for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Bye-bye.